Hi, in this video I want to talk about French nuclear doctrine. I'll say a few things about the French nuclear program in general, but mainly I want to focus on the thinking behind it. Why does France have nuclear weapons? What does France hope to achieve by having nuclear weapons? In what circumstances might France use its nuclear weapons? Along the way, I'm going to talk about various people, including a cast of characters known as the Four Generals of the Apocalypse. My name is Michael Shurkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. And as usual, if you like this video, please hit the like button, and also, if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please hit subscribe. It really helps my channel. It helps me keep doing what I'm doing. France's nuclear program technically started, I believe, in the 1940s, but it really didn't get any real momentum in the 1950s and certainly in the 1960s, with a large amount of help from Charles de Gaulle, who's really the main force behind France's nuclear program. He's the one who made the major political decision to invest just an insane amount of money into developing nuclear capabilities, which basically means it's a huge strategic decision. You've got limited resources, so what are you going to do with those resources? He said, we're going to develop a nuclear program. And you need to keep in mind that developing a nuclear program means not just developing the warheads, which is in and of itself very expensive. You also have to develop the means to deliver the warheads, which means you have to develop aircraft that meet specific requirements, missiles that meet specific requirements, and ultimately nuclear-powered submarines capable of launching missiles. Right? And all of this is profoundly difficult from a technological point of view. So it's like, we think about the Manhattan Project as just being the development of the bomb, but it's not just the bomb, it's also the delivery system, it's the ICBMs, it's the sub-launch systems, the submarines, etc. These things are all, from an industrial and technological point of view and scientific point of view, very, very difficult to do, and really very expensive. And it's de Gaulle who really made that happen by pushing that through. It took a while for France to do this. France tested its first fission device in 1962. It delivered the first warhead in 1963. At the same time, it worked on the Mirage 4. The Mirage 4 was a variant, if you will, loosely based on the Mirage 3, but specifically designed for this strategic nuclear bombing mission. And the first Mirage 4 was put into service in 1964. The French also began work on nuclear-powered submarines. They began work on ICBMs. 1971 was the year that the first nuclear-powered submarine entered into service. 1971 was also the year that France's ground-based ICBMs, they might have actually been medium-range ballistic missiles rather than intercontinental, whatever, that their ground-based missile silos went into service. In 1972, France began fielding tactical nuclear weapons. The first ones were gravity bombs that were designed to be dropped by Mirage 3s. They also fielded in 1974 short-range ballistic missile systems called the Pluton or Pluto that, again, were for tactical nuclear weapons. In 1968, that's when France tested its first fusion device, thermonuclear device, and I believe the first fusion warhead entered into service in 1976. I think, though, all this being said, it's fair to say that it was not until really the 1980s and possibly in the 1990s that you could say that France fielded the full triad of nuclear capabilities using with fusion warheads. Although, also in the 1990s, what happened was France, because of the end of the Cold War and for various other things, decided to get rid of their ground-launched missile systems. They got rid of the tactical nuclear weapons. They decommissioned the Pluto, and they canceled the Hades program. Hades was the system that was supposed to replace the Pluton system. So now, today, France has two legs of the three-legged triad. It has air-launched nuclear weapons. These are mounted on ASMP cruise missiles, which are fired from Rafale fighter jets. And then you have, of course, still the sub-launch ballistic missiles that are fired from their big Triomphant class submarines. So they got two out of the three. What I want to focus on, though, is not the systems. There are lots of people really happy to go on for hours about the ins and outs of the cruise missiles and the submarines and the different kinds of missiles and whether they're MIRVed or not MIRVed and that kind of thing. Whatever. I'm interested in the thinking behind it. Like, why did France do this? Why did France commit itself to spending that much money, vast sums of money, in developing these things? What good does it do? So let's say France has maybe 300 warheads. U.S. has thousands, the Soviets have thousands. What good do 300 warheads do? They only have like a few dozen of these Mirage 4. How many of them really were going to be able to hit their targets? what really is the point of any of this? And also, is there danger here that maybe by France or any other country also having nuclear weapons, and in addition to the United States and the Soviet Union, that you might destabilize this balance of power that I believe the French considered to be ultimately a good thing for the planet? So maybe this was actually a dangerous thing for them to be doing. Before I get into the thinking, though, we need to go back in time a little bit and talk about 5 historical events that I think are critical for understanding why France has nuclear weapons and how France thinks about its nuclear weapons. The first historical event was the fall of France in 1940. And for that generation, they basically swore never again 1940, right? Just never again. And I think that might be the single greatest reason why France developed nuclear weapons. Now, another reason why World War II is important, though, is that the parts of the French army, the officers and leaders of the French army that tried to get France back on its feet and get France back into the fight after the fall of France, we're talking about the Free French Forces and the 2nd Armored Division, the people who formed up in North Africa and fought in Italy and southern France and Germany, etc., they chafed under their extreme dependence on the United States. For these French troops that they're itching to get back into World War II and fight Germans, they had to beg the Americans for everything. You need weapons, you need trucks, you need tanks, you need jeeps, you need clothing, you need food, you need logistics. You got to get it from the Americans. And the Americans sometimes said yes, and they sometimes said no, but ultimately Americans were more likely to say, well, wait in line. Or, the French are all like eager to go. They're in a hurry to do certain things, and the Americans they have other priorities, other things that the Americans wanted to do first. It was an extreme irritant for France. I mean, they understood, but still they chafed under this kind of American control. And it just really brought home, the French were always realizing every single day that they interoperated with the Americans. So the Americans were just operating off of a different list of priorities than they did. The second historical event after World War II was the Indochina War, which began in 1946. Then we have the Algerian War, which begins in 1954. And then the Suez War of 1956. These 3 wars are important because in all 3 of them, the French found themselves once again highly dependent on the United States for various forms of support. So the aircraft they used, the helicopters they used, I think a lot of the weaponry and vehicles that they used were all ultimately American supplied. And the American support for these wars was at best ambivalent. Suez, of course, is famous. The United States did not approve of Suez whatsoever and pulled the plug on the Suez War. But also with Indochina and Algeria, the United States was like, all right, maybe. And they gave them some help, but not others. And the French really had to lobby the Americans to give them more help. Algeria War, the Americans were totally not keen on at all because the Algeria War actually saw France pulling military assets out of Europe that had been allocated for NATO requirements and NATO missions to send them to this colonial war. And from the American point of view, this is terrible because the Americans wanted the French to focus everything on the NATO mission and defending Europe. So again, you have the French sort of running up against the fact that their vital interests were different from the Americans, and they chafed under the dependence on the Americans. They hated the fact that the Kennedy administration had any kind of vote whatsoever in what they were trying to do, or Eisenhower during the Indochina War. They didn't like this one bit, and it was a real problem for France. Now, the 5th historical event, I hope I haven't miscounted here, but anyways, after the wars, the other thing that really weighed heavily on French thinking about nuclear doctrine was the flexible response doctrine that the United States embraced in 1961, or John F. Kennedy embraced in 1961. So flexible response is what they call this policy that basically said, if there's a Soviet act of aggression, what we will not do is just have this knee-jerk massive nuclear retaliation. So we're not just going to go completely berserk in response to a Soviet act of aggression. We will have a measured response, a calibrated response that we deem appropriate for the situation. The French thought this was a terrible idea. From the French point of view, the Americans are basically telegraphing that it's less risky to commit an act of aggression against Europe, because the Americans are communicating that they might not necessarily use their nuclear weapons. They might not necessarily go berserk in response to in response to Soviet aggression. So maybe the Americans would just say, okay, we can live with this event. The French didn't like this at all. They thought that it was terrible. They thought that it weakened deterrence. And basically, again, it just reminded them of the fact that France and the United States have different vital interests, and there was really no particular reason to count on the Americans to defend French interests, particularly now that the continental United States was threatened by Soviet nuclear warheads. All of these things taught the French several lessons here. I mean, the most important being, as I've been saying, that French and American interests, while they usually align and they often overlap, but they're not necessarily identical. They have often very different points of view about what vital interests are. And there's no reason to believe that the Americans would share their priorities, that the Americans would necessarily risk a nuclear war on behalf of interests that the French consider vital, but the Americans consider not vital. Second, the French decided that it was essential that, to the greatest extent possible, be able to exercise strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy means being able to decide for themselves when to go to war, where to go to war, and over what to go to war, which means having independent nuclear military capabilities, and ultimately, because nuclear weapons are the most important of all weapons, having independent, autonomous nuclear capabilities. Now, arguably, French strategic autonomy has never really existed as much as the French would like to think, such that, for instance, during the recent French operations in Africa, operations Serval and Barkhane, 2013 to 2022, the French military, to a considerable extent, was actually dependent on American intelligence and logistical support. And I think it's fair to say that it's very hard for France to mount large conventional military operations without some form of American help. However, that being said, I do think it's true that France has successfully built a nuclear capability that is entirely autonomous. The French can nuke countries on their own without anybody's help and without needing anybody's help and without needing anybody to approve of whatever they're going to do. Nobody gets to give their opinions about whether or not the French should nuke anybody, and the French don't have the need to ask anybody's opinion if they don't want to. So from a certain policy perspective, that is a success. A way in which the French have done this is by steadfastly making their nuclear capabilities 100% made in France. I'm referring not only to the warheads, but also to the aircraft and the submarines and the missiles and everything that sort of goes around that, including the nuclear industry, right, to build the reactors for the submarines. This is all 100% made in France. They don't want to have to import the stuff from somebody else, even if it's an ally or a close friend, because ultimately you're relying on them, and ultimately you're exposing yourself to their opinion or to their ability to obstruct you in your priorities and your policy decisions. The French have prioritized the nuclear autonomy to such an extent that the nuclear capabilities are what the French call structurant, the idea being that everything in terms of the military, in terms of the defense industry, is structured around delivering nuclear capabilities. So the number one job of the French military, at least the Air Force and the Navy, is the nuclear capabilities. So their ability to drop bombs or to fire the cruise missiles or to fire the ICBMs. And everything is organized around that. So it's about building those submarines, building those Rafale, and then building all the enablers that support the mission of the submarines and support the mission of the Rafale, of course, including the missiles. All of this stuff has to be made in France. That's what matters most. Everything else is basically icing on the cake. This is also true for French industry. The priority is being able to make the key components of nuclear capabilities. The architects of France's nuclear doctrine are frequently referred to as the four generals of the apocalypse. These are General Charles Ayeret, 1907-1968, General André Beaufre, 1902-1975, General Pierre Gallois, 1911-2010, and Lucien Poirier, 1918-2013. To this, we must add the civilian philosopher Raymond Aron, 1905-1903. Aron was not a military, 1983. Aron was not, he wasn't in the military, he was a university professor, but he very publicly engaged in debates about nuclear doctrine, and he pushed back against the generals, and he got into very public and sometimes kind of nasty fights in public with Pierre Gallois. And I think that by doing so, he really contributed to French thinking about nuclear weapons. Even by contradicting the generals, it meant that the generals had to respond. They had to think. I'd say that Aron elevated the discourse, and he brought things to the public's attention, and he helped sort of fertilized the public debate and also the internal debate within the French government, the French military about nuclear weapons and nuclear doctrine, which is why I do think it's important to include Raymond Aron in any of these conversations. I mean, the books that that I'm referencing here, of course, Beaufre's best book on this is Introduction to Strategy. This is a magnificent book. It was translated into English. I know there's a PDF floating around somewhere that I absolutely need to find and then I could post. Beaufre also wrote these little books like Destabilize stratégie, so this is deterrence and strategy. And then you've got like Lucien Poirier's book, Des stratégies nucléaires, super interesting book, not as good of a writer as Beaufre. And then you've got Raymond Aron's book, Le Grand Débat. This is almost like a big polemic against General Gallois. It's super interesting. It gives you his views about all the points that the four generals argue. I really regret this. This copy came with all the pages uncut, and in my attempts to cut the pages, look at the horrible violence that I did to this. It's criminal, really. It's a war crime. Anyways, the four generals, I think, by and large, agreed on certain points, and I want to go into these points because I think it sums up the French doctrine fairly nicely. Aron agreed with some of them, disagreed with others. I don't really get into that. It's like a whole other video about like Aron's positioning with respect to each of the four generals, and I could spend an hour on each of the four generals and then another hour on Aron, etc. But for our purposes here, we're not going to get into that. Okay, point number one. Nuclear weapons really changed everything with respect to strategy, military strategy. Everything was different, and now everything had to be rethought. Nuclear weapons were really the only thing that mattered, which of course meant that now that the big difference in the world is between countries that have nuclear weapons and countries that don't have nuclear weapons. Now, the second part, point two, is that nuclear weapons are so destructive that they level the playing field for anybody who actually has any. So you've got the countries that don't have nuclear weapons and the countries that do have nuclear weapons. But among the countries that do have nuclear weapons, it almost doesn't matter if you've got 1,000 of them or a few hundred of them. This is at least according to the four generals. And Gallois, in fact, famously argued that if little Denmark were just to acquire one nuclear-propelled submarine with nuclear-tipped ICBMs, that this would guarantee safety, like deter any aggression against Denmark. And he was basically arguing for Denmark to actually go and do so, which Aron, by the way, thought was an absolutely ridiculous argument. But I digress. Also, point number three, nobody would use nuclear weapons unless their vital interests were at stake, which, according to the generals, is very important. According to the generals, this means that in a crisis, it was very likely that alliances would break down. Why? Because no state would use nuclear weapons on behalf of another state unless it thought that it itself was threatened, which was not a given. This is very important. You cannot count on another country to use nuclear weapons to defend your vital interests. It will only use nuclear weapons if its own vital interests. So maybe that other country with nuclear weapons will see in you, your well-being, its vital interests, but maybe not. 4, a smaller country like France does not need to wield the same destructive power as the two major nuclear powers because potential adversaries would understand the proportionality between what was at stake and the risk involved. So to put it in other terms, France could, they thought with confidence, could destroy a few Soviet cities. France, according to them, was not worth the risk of a few cities. There's no plausible scenario, according to these guys, that the Soviets would ever think it was in their interest to destroy or invade France at the risk of having several of its cities nuked. So this was already a net benefit in having nuclear weapons. It also meant that France only needed to be able to destroy a few Soviet cities. It didn't need to be able to destroy the entire country or the entire planet. 5, nuclear weapons at least guaranteed the, I don't know how to say this word in any language, the sanctuarization of the homeland, given that the single greatest bet, the single most likely way to trigger a nuclear response is by attacking a country's homeland, right? Attacking in the homeland. So this meant that nobody would touch France itself. Somebody might touch external interests, peripheral interests, maybe external territories, etc., but the homeland at least would be a sanctuary thanks to nuclear weapons. 6, for French nuclear weapons to have any deterrence value, the French nuclear capabilities had to be credible. You had to believe that France could do it, but also you had to believe that France would, in the right circumstances, do it. Now, as for what those circumstances might be, the French believed that it was essential to cultivate uncertainty on the part of one's adversaries. You have to keep them guessing as to what your red lines were. One result of that is that General Beaufre argued that France should not adopt a no first strike policy. And I believe to this day, France refuses to make any statements that suggest any limitations about choices about when France will or won't or might use its nuclear weapons. We might strike first, we might strike second, we might do this, we might do that. You don't want to commit yourself because you want to be able to keep them guessing. And this is really very important. Another element that the four generals talk about is also crazy. They thought that it probably helped if French leaders could convince their potential adversaries that they just might be crazy enough to use nuclear weapons. Now, whether or not they've accomplished that, I don't know. Raymond Aron brought that up, and he expressed some reservations about that. He said, in effect, maybe Charles de Gaulle could have pulled that off because he was kind of crazy, but the others, would Francois Hollande, is he that crazy? Is Macron that crazy? I don't know. That's another conversation. One of the questions, though, that the four generals and Raymond Aron chewed over is this question about whether or not the nuclear balance between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was destabilized by France having nuclear weapons. And their answer was no. So Beaufre, for example, he argued that a third country that has nuclear weapons that's allied with a larger power, one of the things that they could do is that for one thing, that the small country could actually blackmail the larger country. Basically, since their interests do not necessarily not the same, France, by virtue of nuclear weapons, could threaten to use them and thus force the United States to take its side and to actually back up France and blackmail. And both responded to this criticism that he's saying that they would blackmail the larger ally by saying, well, all's fair in love and war. That's just so. He also thought that ultimately this would cause the allies to work together, the nuclear-powered allies at least, to talk to each other, to coordinate, to share more common interests, to have a general understanding about what their interests were, what their vital interests were. And he also said that in this scenario, it often would only suffice for the larger ally to simply express its solidarity with the smaller ally to extend the deterrence value to the smaller ally. So he said that this is a good thing. This increases the overall deterrence value of the whole alliance. Beaufre also argued that there was a value to having more than one nuclear power in an alliance because it made risk calculations on the part of the adversary a lot more difficult. If only one country has a nuclear capabilities, the adversary can focus on, well, what is the risk that that one country in a given scenario would use its nuclear weapons? That's already a hard challenge, but it's relatively confined. If another country has nuclear weapons, now you got two countries. Now you have to worry about the probable reactions of two countries, which already it's like you're doubling at the very least, or squaring the complexity of the whole problem. And then if there's a third country, etc. So this is really a really bad thing for the adversary, and thus Beaufre believes that this makes ultimately the deterrence value a lot more stronger because it's much harder for the adversary to calculate the risk of carrying out some sort of act of aggression. And to be clear, Beaufre did not believe in proliferation, nuclear proliferation. He basically believed that some countries could be trusted with nuclear weapons, some countries could not be trusted with nuclear weapons. So the Netherlands, you could trust the Dutch with nuclear weapons, you can trust the Swedes with nuclear weapons, you can trust the Swiss with nuclear weapons, but Cuba, he said, no. The United Arab Republic, which is then a short-lived fusion between Egypt and Syria, he said no. Or Indonesia, no, you can't trust Indonesia. And then he says, quote, one must keep matches out of the hands of children, unquote. Okay, so there are two areas, though, by the way, where the French generals, the French theorists, really didn't come to any clear conclusions. And this has to do with tactical nuclear weapons, both the purpose and the value, and also how would you actually use them in battle. So they had different ideas, and of course they had tactical nuclear weapons, and they thought about maybe you could use the tactical nuclear weapons as sort of like a final warning. There's also a question of trying to integrate them into maneuver warfare, because like if you're up against some armor divisions, you could nuke one of the enemy's armor divisions, and thus this would help balance out the enemy's numerical superiority. I never got a sense, though, from reading French doctrine on the tactical weapons that they were ever really convinced by any of this. In part because if your plan is to nuke Soviet divisions, that might not do any good because, for one thing, the Soviets can disperse their divisions. Also, this means that you're nuking the battlefield that you're trying to operate on. And oh, by the way, the battlefield's in Germany where a lot of people live, so you're killing a lot of Germans. Is that really a good idea? Oh no, let's not forget the fact that Soviets have their own tactical nuclear weapons. So if you're expecting to use nuclear weapons to level the playing field in terms of their numerical superiority, well, then they can go nuke your armored divisions, and then you're back to square one. They were never really convinced, and I think this is why they were willing to give the tactical weapons up in the 1990s. Today, I'd argue that the real merit of France's nuclear doctrine is the emphasis that they placed on autonomy. France's ability to use its nuclear weapons, it's theirs, and it's theirs alone. They wholly own it. And it's their call to make when to use them, when not to use them. It's their systems, their warheads, their aircraft, their submarines. They don't have to ask for anybody's permission. And of course, the bad news is that having a capability that's 100% national means that it's very hard to share. It also means that there's a fundamental contradiction in French military policy with respect to its growing costs for European defense and European commitment, and for Europe to pool its resources, and its refusal to share what by definition has to be a national capability in terms of the nuclear weapons themselves, but also the industrial capability of building their own stuff. And in a sense, they're asking Europeans to say, okay, we can't trust the Americans, but you're really going to have to trust our leadership, because we're the ones with the nuclear weapons, and we're the ones who are the arbiters of the nuclear guarantee, and the arbiters of when we're going to use this, and we're the ones who own nuclear deterrence. So from a European point of view, you could ask, why is this any better than relying on the Americans for the same kind of thing? But also, again, there's this contradiction, particularly from the industrial part. Like if everybody agrees now, European militaries have to buy common things. They all have to buy the same aircraft and the same armored vehicles, etc., in order to economize and to create economies of scale. And the French are involved. So, for instance, the French are involved in a multinational effort to develop a sixth-generation fighter. You have to wonder, though, how that's really going to work, given that it runs so against the grain for the French to not have a 100% wholly French-made aircraft for the purpose of being able to deliver wholly French-made nuclear weapons. And I think one way in which having nuclear weapons obviously benefits France is that it gives France an influence and stature that otherwise it would not have, particularly not since the end of the colonial empire and the wars of decolonization. Once upon a time, France was a great power, in part because it had this vast European global empire. The empire is now gone, but it's got nuclear weapons, right? And this is, I think, something that de Gaulle was thinking about, because remember, de Gaulle is also the guy who oversaw the dismantling of the French Empire, while at the same time overseeing the development of nuclear weapons. And I think he understood that it was sort of a way of maintaining France's stature while it's shedding its colonies. So you shed the colonies, but then you develop nuclear weapons. It has never been clear, though, whether or not France's deterrence capabilities ever actually mattered, right? So did the Soviets worry about France's nuclear weapons? Did they ever think, well, maybe we could do this act of aggression, but oh shit, the French could nuke us? I really have no idea. It's really hard to say. Raymond Aron challenged this idea, and he thought that this is laughable. Raymond Aron said, he said, in what scenario is there that somebody would be deterred by France's nuclear weapons after not having been deterred by America's nuclear weapons? How could that possibly be? So Aron basically said there is no such scenario. Therefore, it ultimately wasn't worth France's while to develop its nuclear weapons, and Aron thought it should invest its money in more conventional capabilities. I would argue that everything ultimately, though, depends on the extent to which you can count on the United States. For the four generals said that France could not. Aron said that they could. Aron was perhaps the most pro-American, the most Atlanticist of all of these characters. But now you have to wonder, it looks to me more and more like the generals were right, and that Charles de Gaulle was right all along, and that maybe Aron was wrong. Thank you for watching this video. Please, again, if you like it, hit like and subscribe. Also, if you go to the description of this video, I put links to my LinkedIn, my Blue Sky, my Twitter, also my website, michaelsharkin.com, as well as my Substack, also called Pax Americana. I write for that weekly. And I've also put links to some various relevant articles. And that's it. Please stay tuned. There's more videos to come. There's much more in that pipeline. And thank you very much, and see you next time. Bye-bye.